I'd been pregnant during our last days of touring in 1989, and so the bus became too rough for me to travel on. We started flying. We loved it so much that after Shelby was born, we decided to sell my bus to Patty Loveless and continue flying. We've been flying ever since. In 1990, I was flying to all of my dates. I could leave for a show around 6 p.m. along with Sandy Spica, my hairdresser and designer, and Narvel, and be home by around 2 a.m. to spend the night in my own bed. I could be there when Shelby woke up in the morning and spend the day with him, instead of spending it in a hotel room somewhere or staring out the window of the bus as the miles between our jobs went by. The band continued for the majority of our dates to travel by bus, and since Narvel and I weren't traveling along with them anymore, the job of tour manager took on new importance. The tour manager was the one who had to keep it all together, and who had to handle any crisis with personnel, paraphernalia, or transportation that might arise along the way. Jim Hammond was the consummate pro. In 1988, when Narvel became my manager and the overseer of my entire organization, Jim took over as tour manager. From then on, he and Narvel had a kind of friendly competition, always trying to outthink each other on ways to improve the show. Perhaps more than anybody else in the organization, Jim lived rather than worked his job. He was a benevolent control freak. I felt totally secure as he led me on and off stage through the dark and twisting hallways that opened in front of thousands of people. Many times I'd walk to the back of the stage at the end of the show after the spotlight had blinded me, and from out of nowhere, Jim's hand would grab me right above the elbow, and he'd steer me safely through the noise, crowds, and confusion. A big part of Jim's job was supervising the musicians, but Jim managed to retain the musicians' goodwill while gaining their respect. I still can't believe what Sandy Spica, who is normally quiet and reserved in new situations, what she did to Jim on the second day she knew him. She had just joined the show, but she got up the nerve to play one of those inevitable road jokes on Jim. He was snoring on the couch in the middle of the day when she applied fuchsia nail polish to Jim's beefy fingernails. Sandy remembers that it wasn't until it was time to eat that Jim noticed his bright fingernails. She said he had the most confused look on his face. Jim looked like a grizzly, but he had the soft heart of a teddy bear. Let me introduce you to the other members of my musical family at that time, as we began touring after our Christmas break in early 1991. Kurt Capello was my band leader and musical director, a genius I had hired away from Barbara Mandrell in 1989. He could play his keyboard while directing the other players and the singers without missing anything else happening on stage. Kirk was a real individualist. When we toured, I liked to sightsee in the cities where we played, and usually the band would come with me, but not Kirk. Larry Jones used to say that trying to get Kirk to do things with me, his boss, was as hard as getting a teenager to do something with his parents. When I wanted to stop to see Niagara Falls, Kirk refused to get off the bus. And in Los Angeles, he snuck out halfway through the Universal Studios tour, but I didn't mind. One of my backup singers, Paula K. Evans, was just the opposite of Kirk. She was like a tourist at almost every stop, running around sightseeing and taking pictures. On one trip, she waded into snow that was as deep as she was tall. There were many times they'd get into a town real tired from the road, and everybody else would want to rest until showtime, but not Paula. No matter how many miles or hours she'd gone, Paula K. was ready for a sightseeing tour. Paula K. also loved to paint. I have 2 tiny watercolors that she gave me of vases and flowers, which I cherish. Guitarist Michael Thomas came to work for me after working with T. Graham Brown. He was simply one of the best guitar players around, an artist with as much stage presence as talent. Michael's wit was extremely dry, and naturally, his special target was often Jim Hammond. Now, Jim was a heavy eater himself, but he just hated having to wait for slowpokes when they would all stop to eat. Then came the night in Texas when Jim was the last to finish dinner and get back on the bus. "Where's Hammond? Where's Hammond?" the band was chanting. "He's still inside," Michael said without emotion, waiting on his deep-fried Shetland pony. My drummer, Tony Saputo, was one of the other joke masters in the band. Jennifer Bowler remembers a time when the bus broke down about an hour outside of Nashville. As everyone else sat fuming, waiting for its repair, Tony suddenly came bounding from the back of the bus, dressed as a mummy. He had wrapped himself in toilet paper from head to foot. Tony had a loving, almost childlike nature. Bass guitar player Terry Jackson, who had moved to Nashville with Tony, claimed that he liked touring because of his apartment. He had signed a 6-month lease on a place in a hip apartment complex overlooking the Cumberland River, wondering a little why no one else had grabbed it. Well, he soon learned that it was directly across the river from the city's sewage plant. He said the odor was so foul he could taste it. No wonder his rent was so cheap. He was one of the few black musicians in the country music business, and he was making a name for himself. He was great. Chris Austin was a new addition to the band, and he showed up for work on his first day carrying a Bible and his guitar. A veteran of the Ricky Skaggs Show, he was a born-again Christian who was also a talented secular and Christian songwriter. I hired him to sing harmony. His voice blended beautifully with Paula Kaye's. Keyboard player Joey Saganaro was an innocent young man in that he hadn't been on the road all that long. He was truly a gentleman as well as a real professional. No matter how far we had to travel between restaurants or motels or show venues, no matter if we were playing in 100-degree heat or in Canada in January, he never complained. He was always on time and prepared to play. If all the players had been like Joey, I might not have needed a tour manager. The reason I'm going into so much detail about these 8 people, I'm sure you already know. We lost the Crazy 8, as Garth Brooks called them, in March of 1991. Rounding out our band were Joe McGlohan and Pete Finney. Joe, my saxophone player, was one of the passengers on the second airplane, which landed safely in Nashville. After the crash, Joe took over the guidance of the band, and today is still my band leader. Pete Finney, who played steel guitar in the band, also flew on the second plane. As we began the early 1991 leg of the tour, our performance schedule was so heavy that sometimes we had to move our entire organization by plane. The week beginning March 11, 1991, we were booked into 4 different cities spread across the country over 6 days. We had a show in Saginaw, Michigan, then a private show for IBM in San Diego. Then we had to make it to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then to Evansville, Indiana. Finally, we'd fly back to San Diego for another private show. We'd been leasing our planes from Roger Woolsey. He leased us 2 small jet planes, a Sabreliner and a Hawker. For the Saginaw show, Narvel, Sandy, and I flew up and back home in the Sabreliner. Roger flew back to Saginaw to get the band and crew. The band and crew traveled to Saginaw by bus, but got on the planes to fly to San Diego. Narvel, Sandy, and I flew out that afternoon in the Hawker, and by the time we touched down in San Diego's Lindbergh Field, the band was already in town and getting ready for the show. Jim Hammond stood in the rain to meet us at the airport. As soon as Jim got into the limousine beside us, the talk turned to airplanes. "The Hawker is a little bigger than the Sabreliner," Jim said. "Do you all mind if we take the Hawker to Fort Wayne and you all take the Sabreliner when we fly back?" Well, that was fine with us. They needed the room more than we did. As we rode to the Harbor Island Sheraton Inn, where we would do our show and where Narvel, Sandy, and I would spend the night, Jim brought up another problem. "Well, we got a dilemma here," Jim said. "The show is at 9 o'clock. That means Reba's going to come off about 10:15. But there's an 11 o'clock curfew at the airport." So Narvel told Jim to have the pilots fly the Sabreliner and the Hawker over to nearby Brown Field. It had no curfew, and the band members could take their time getting to their planes after the concert. The band did not play on Sweet Dreams, my encore song. I always sang it a cappella. Instead, they went to their rooms to pack up, and thanks to the change in airports, many had time to call home and take showers before heading out. Narvel was watching television, and I was asleep when I was jolted awake by the ringing of a telephone. Who could that be at this time of night, I wondered. It was Roger Woolsey, our pilot. "Can you come to my room?" Roger asked Narvel. "I think something bad has happened." "I'll be right there," I heard my husband say as he hung up the phone. He dressed quickly while I asked questions he couldn't answer. I sat upright in bed. I wouldn't lie down again until the next night at my home in Tennessee. Later, Narvel would describe Roger as being white as a sheet when he walked into his room. "I watched everybody get on both planes," Roger said to Narvel. "Both planes taxied to the end of the runway, and I got into my car to come back to the hotel. I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw this huge ball of fire, and I don't know if it was them or not." Roger couldn't return to the airport that night because it was closed, since our planes had been the last two to take off that night. So when Narvel got to his room, he found Roger dialing madly to get information. Finally, Roger hung up the telephone and turned to Narvel. "Yes," he said, "a plane did go down." I remember that I was still sitting in the same position when Narvel came back. He told me what Roger had learned, and I asked, "Is everybody okay?" "No," Narvel said, "they're not. Reba, it's a possibility that everybody is dead." "Oh, Narvel, surely not," I said. I burst into tears. Narvel telephoned Mike Allen, who booked the date, and Sandy Spica, and asked them to come to our room. It was a while before we would receive confirmation that it was one of our planes that had gone down. And even then, there was no word about survivors. Through radio contact, the pilot of our aircraft, still in the air, had supplied his passenger list, so we could figure out who was on the fallen plane. It was now approaching 6 a.m. in Texas and Oklahoma, where Narvel's and my parents lived. We didn't want them to hear the news on television or the radio before we talked to them, so Narvel called his parents and I called mine. After I heard my daddy say hello, I lost it again. Like a dream, it all went through my mind. They'll never hear their daddy's voices again. "Hello, Daddy," I said. "This is Reba. I'm okay, but something terrible has happened." "Okay," he said. I could tell he'd been sound asleep. "We're in San Diego, and the band and crew flew out on 2 planes, and one of them went down, and we're pretty sure everyone's dead." That was the first time I'd heard myself say it. Narvel called 9 families, including his parents, during the next 2 hours. I would follow Narvel pacing from room to room in our suite, crying. But Narvel kept a level head, and he later said that staying busy kept him from breaking up. Many times that night I saw him silently hold a telephone while I heard someone screaming at the other end of the line. It was worse than any nightmare I could imagine. The cable news network and other channels were updating the reports. I called Barbara Mandrell in the hours after the incident because Kurt Capello, my musical director, had worked for her before he joined me, and I thought she should know. Barbara is also my closest girlfriend in the music business. I respect her a lot.